I'm Nicholas Henshall, and this is a podcast on law and covenant in Old Testament narrative. By way of preface, this short introduction to that theme started life as a talk given to the sixth form at St Benedict's Catholic High School in Derby on the 10th of October 2007. The text is substantially as it was originally delivered, and I hope still bears the sense of being a live document rather than simply a lecture. The text of this talk is also available on the Chelmsford Cathedral website. You may also enjoy a much shorter YouTube video under the title Introduction to the Prophet Micah. The link is on the website in this document. Despite its title, this short talk serves as an introduction on how the Old Testament works and is helpful background to the discussion in this podcast. Introduction. Within quite a short time frame, I am intending to provide an introduction to the understanding of law and covenant in Old Testament narrative. Some of this may be very familiar territory, and some of it may be completely new, both in terms of the subject matter and the manner of approach. Please feel free to ask questions in a disciplined manner, for as one of my oldest friends said to me the first time we ever met, "Nick, you are a man who needs interrupting." My background is that of what I would call a practicing theologian, in that I am someone who has engaged with theology at a high academic level and continues to do so, but has also worked hard to see how theology works out in Christian discipleship through 14 years as an inner city vicar in Newcastle upon Tyne, 6 years at Derby Cathedral, 7 years in North Yorkshire as a parish priest, and so far 6 years at Chelmsford Cathedral. So this stuff really matters to me, not simply as an academic exercise or discipline, but as part of my daily life. A story, getting to synagogue. My friend Scott is an Orthodox Jew. With shockingly blonde hair and clear blue eyes, he does not look typically so, but he claims that this is what all Ukrainian Jews, at least in his family, look like. Scott has a problem. Jewish law forbids all work on Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath. In modern Israel, all sorts of technologies have been developed to cope with this. So the law says that you can't put the oven on a Saturday. But you can get a very sophisticated timer that you set the previous day, so that you aren't doing any work. But Scott lives in Paris, not in Israel, and his problem is that he lives a long way from the synagogue. The reason Jews tend to live near the synagogue is that they're not allowed to drive to get there. That will be doing work. And you're only allowed to walk around 7 miles on the Sabbath. So what does Scott do? When the only feasible way is to take the metro. Some of it turns out to be easier than he thought. His rabbi tells him that it is okay to use the escalators and the actual metro train. These are already in motion. So he's not causing work to happen. But there is a problem with the ticket, certainly. He can buy one the day before, but if he carries it, he will be breaking the Jewish law. Eventually the rabbi cracks it. Scott can buy his ticket the day before and pin it to the outside of his jacket. Then on Saturday morning, he simply presents himself at the ticket barrier and technically, legally, he is not doing any work. So he's not breaking the Sabbath, so he's not breaking the commandments. And that's a true story. It's not an understanding of law, even religious law or regulation, that we may find at all easy to understand. Along with not eating bacon and wearing skull caps, we may be able to see this as the quaint custom of an ancient religious group, but law? God's law? And this God is not someone else's God, but the God of the Bible, our God too. So what is law in the Old Testament? How does it work? And what on earth does it mean? A short history lesson. Any attempt to understand Jewish law, indeed any attempt to understand anything about Judaism, and therefore some of the core themes in Christianity, must be rooted in an understanding of Old Testament history. Remember, the Old Testament was the Bible that Jesus quoted. Our New Testament did not reach its present form until some 300 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, Paul, and the early Christian tradition do their preaching and teaching on the understanding that we are deeply at home within the Old Testament narrative. For instance, how can we understand Mary as a virgin without knowing that the whole Old Testament tradition regards virginity as a disgrace? Luke's point is that, just like, say, Jacob or David in the Old Testament, in the upside-down valleys of the kingdom, this is exactly the kind of person God would choose to give birth to the Messiah, i.e. the wrong person. The great passages in the book of Revelation, like I saw a new heaven and a new earth, are almost complete gobbledygook unless we know the Old Testament book of Ezekiel. And how do we understand John the Baptist if we don't know about Elijah and so on? Never forget that in its origins, Christianity is the daughter of Judaism, and for much of its early history was a fundamentally Oriental religion. As law and history walk hand in hand throughout the Old Testament narrative, we cannot get a handle on one without getting a handle on the other. So here goes. The two crucial episodes of the Old Testament narrative for us are the Exodus and the exile. And the story goes like this, with those two as great big hinges of a great door. A people called the Hebrews find themselves as an ethnic minority enslaved in Egypt. They have deep memories of ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, now lost in the mists of time and probably best dated to the early 2nd millennium BC. During a period of serious oppression, normally dated to the 13th century BC, a leader named Moses in the Bible rises up and leads the Hebrews out of Egypt. A miraculous crossing of the sea on dry land is followed by an extraordinary encounter at Mount Sinai. Moses goes up the mountain and receives the law from God. Eventually, after 40 years of getting lost in the Arabian Peninsula, the Hebrews arrive in the promised land of Israel and begin to establish a new community. All of this together constitutes the Exodus, celebrated by Jews right up to the present day at Passover as the key journey from slavery to freedom, which formed them as a people. And of course, it is the deep background to the Christian Easter, but that's for another time. Some 200 years of exploration and consolidation follow as the Jews colonise and settle, gradually removing the existing inhabitants of the land. The leaders of Israel at this time are called the judges, figures like Deborah and Samson. Amid controversy, a king is established. The people ask for this. They say they want a king like all the other nations. Samuel, who's the current prophetic leader, says that God is their only king. But eventually and reluctantly, he appoints a king called Saul. He's a great war leader, but ultimately a failure. Notably for later generations, this is often seen as the first step in Israel's failure. Then David becomes king. In a sense, this is the high point of Israel's history, the Golden Age. The traditional date for David in Jerusalem is 1000 BC. David establishes Jerusalem as the capital city, and his son Solomon builds the temple. And in a sense, that is it for the next 400 years. King follows king, and gradually things just get worse. The odd king behaves well, but then the next king gets it even more badly wrong. In 722, the northern capital Samaria falls to the Assyrian Empire. That's a bit like Manchester being taken over by the Germans during the Second World War, a calamity both in terms of power and morale. The southern kingdom, the only bit of Israel left, staggers on. There is a brief revival under King Josiah, who during his long reign of 31 years in the 7th century tries to reform Israel. This is kick-started when he discovers the Book of the Law, generally thought to be some form of Deuteronomy, and tries to put it into practice. But it's far too late, and eventually catastrophe strikes. This time it is the Persians who arrive as conquerors. They capture Jerusalem, and between 597 and 587 BC, they deport most of the population to Babylon, leaving behind some of the poorest of the land to tend the crops. The exile is the absolute catastrophe of Judaism, if you like, a reversal of the Exodus. If the Exodus made them a people, the exile nearly destroyed them, a theme to which we shall return, as it is crucial to this discussion. From the late 6th century, the people begin to return from Babylon to rebuild a shattered world. So that's a potted history of Israel, and it is important to the discussion of law because of the fundamental conviction of the Jewish writers of the Old Testament that God's justice and righteousness are revealed in the history of his people. The Old Testament is the story of a relationship between God and Israel. The modern division between politics and religion simply does not exist in this context. They are one and the same. And though God may tolerate the kingship, he is the only true Lord of the people and the source of both authority and love. So the covenant. The Exodus and the giving of the law at Sinai together represent God's covenant with his chosen people. You shall be my people and I will be your God, as it says in Ezekiel 36. That is the constant refrain of this relationship. The law, in a sense, represents the terms of the covenant. But it is important that we recognise that this is rather different from the kind of contract law we may be familiar with in English. A contract lays down the terms of the agreement between each side, and if either breaks the terms, then the contract is over. The Old Testament understanding of covenant is rather different. God does give Moses laws and instructions, yes, and he does say, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy, this is the way, follow it. And he does say that there will be sanctions if the people of Israel do not follow the law and instructions. But, and this is crucial, the Old Testament narrative makes it clear that God also promises never to give up on his people. Yes, there may be punishment. Yes, there may be reward. But ultimately, God will never stop loving his chosen people. He will never give up on them, whatever they do. And it is crucial that the terms of this promise take place not in a law court, but in an encounter with mystery. Moses enters the cloud on top of the mountain and receives the law in an overwhelming, indeed literally transfiguring experience of the power and the presence of God. This is difficult territory for us to enter. Our culture, and particularly the popular reception of existentialism, has made us doubt even the possibility of this kind of covenant. We talk in contract terms of honouring rights and obligations rather than open-ended covenants. And our notion of law and regulation is that it has its origins in an attempt to regulate human behaviour rather than as an exercise in mystical theology. The word that best characterises covenant is promise. It is not a guarantee but an assurance, a promise that whatever happens, God's love will never fail. It is an understanding beautifully expressed in the songs of the prophet Isaiah, almost certainly written in the context of the exile, and for which the best modern parallel is, or at least should be, the promises of marriage and of parenthood, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. An open-ended covenant, a promise of love that does not depend ultimately on us keeping our side of the bargain. Here are some words from Isaiah chapter 63. I will recount the steadfast love of the Lord, the praises of the Most High, all that God has done for us in his mercy by his many acts of love. For God said, surely they are my people, my children who will not deal falsely. And he became their saviour in all their distress. So God redeemed them by his love and pity. He lifted them up and carried them through all the days of old. And something about law. Law in the Old Testament can only be understood if we first grasp this understanding of covenant. And it is important because as soon as we look at Old Testament law, we realise that it is rather different from what we expect. It's a linguistic point, but important nonetheless. The word law in English reflects not the Hebrew, but the Greek translation and understanding of the word nomos. The Hebrew word Torah does not really mean law in this formal, almost courtroom sense. Rather, it means something like instructions. That's why the content of the first 5 books of the Bible, also called the Pentateuch or the Torah, do not look much like a book of law to us. Indeed, there is no evidence that they were even used as a book for the law courts until after the exile, for reasons that may appear later. So this law is more like instructions for living, and it functions not as the terms of a contract, but as the ground rules for a covenant. And these instructions are remarkably diverse. A quick glance through the books of Exodus and Leviticus will give us something as familiar as the Ten Commandments and love your neighbour as yourself. That's Leviticus 19:18. And think on that. We think on that as a quote from Jesus in the Gospels, but in fact it's Jesus quoting the Jewish law, alongside the frankly esoteric, such as the prohibition on eating rock badgers in Leviticus 11:5 and regulations for infectious skin diseases, itches and mildew in Leviticus 14. But to approach it in this way is to misunderstand the nature of Jewish law and its role in Judaism. For the Pentateuch is not simply lists of laws. It is stories, ideas, discussion. It begins, after all, with a double story of creation and of early humanity. That's Genesis chapters 1 to 11, whose purpose was never to give a scientific or historical description of the origins of the universe. We know that from the text itself. After all, it gives two versions of the creation story in which everything happens in different orders. No, the purpose of these 11 chapters is to place the whole law in the context not simply of God's covenant with Israel, but in the context of an understanding of God as the origin and creator of all things, and an understanding of human frailty, sin, and the need for redemption. So it is a strange kind of law or instruction we're dealing with, certainly for us. But there is more. The Hebrew Bible, more or less what we call the Old Testament, is traditionally divided into three parts. The law, that's the first 5 books, the prophets, which includes all the history books, as well as the named prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, and the writings, that's the Psalms, Proverbs, Job. They're sometimes called the wisdom literature. The first 5 books, the Pentateuch or the Torah, are unequivocally the 5 books of the law and are what a Jew today would probably call the Bible. But in fact, the whole of the Old Testament is the law. Let me seek to explain. Now, this is really important. So this is the whole of the Old Testament as law. Torah, number 1. So the Exodus establishes the key themes of law and covenant that we've already explored. It establishes that the key story is all about the relationship between God and his chosen people. This relationship is characterized on God's side by promise, a promise of love that will never fail or be withdrawn. And on the people's side is characterized by a promise to live by the instructions that God has given to Moses, in full understanding that there will be sanctions and rewards, but that in the recklessness of God's promise and the people's response, the covenant itself can never be broken. They're in this forever together. Part 2, the prophets. The next part of the Hebrew Bible is a sustained analysis of how this relationship goes wrong over a period of more than 500 years. There are 2 bits of this analysis. The first are the books by named prophets. These are named individuals, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth, mostly dating from the 8th to the 6th centuries BC. And their words come down to us in a form probably written down and edited by their disciples and later tradition. It's really important, however, for us to remember that the word prophet in Hebrew, nabi, does not mean somebody who looks into the future, but rather a channel of communication between God and his people. They're a bit like God's political commentators, looking at what is going on and warning of the consequences. Amos, a famous prophet in the 8th century, seeks to help people recognise that their way of life is a disaster, and that if they do not do something about it, then the future is very dark indeed. In the same way, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, prophets who are part of the exile, are eyewitnesses to the catastrophe. Their writings are an attempt to make sense of that loss, the loss of everything, and seek to point to a different future. Given their background, the prophets supply a devastating critique of Israel and its failures. Some of them do focus on the equivalent of whatever you use the metro to get to synagogue or not, like my friend Scott. But most have much greater subtlety and realise that Israel's sin and the consequent punishment for that sin is not focused on the breaking of particular laws, whether about marriage or eating rock badgers, but in Israel's choice to go its own way, not the way of the covenant of love, to which the law should call them back. In this, the prophets often remind us of the preaching of Jesus, and indeed, Jesus' first sermon in Luke's Gospel begins with a straight quote from Isaiah. This is Isaiah 61, quoted by Jesus in Luke chapter 4. "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." This lies at the heart of the Old Testament prophetic tradition. The people may even have kept the rules, offered sacrifice and so forth, but in a way that feeds directly into New Testament tradition and teaching, they have neglected the core demands of the law. The sacrifice of God, says Psalm 51, a psalm almost certainly written in the context of the exile, is a broken and contrite heart. So it is not some automatic righteousness. For loyalty is my desire and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. That's Hosea chapter 6. This prophetic tradition is a very radical critique of the law itself and of Israel's inability to live by the love and promise of the covenant, even if they may well keep the conventional rules in daily life. The prophetic tradition puts forward the argument that Israel failed, not because of a failure to keep the law itself, but through a failure to understand the nature of the covenant under which the law made sense. However, hidden in this devastating criticism is, of course, the promise of a future. The people may have got it wrong, but if the covenant is what the prophets say it is, then God's love can never fail. He will forgive and lead them back. And this promise gives rise to some of the most beautiful poetry in the Old Testament. The history books like 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings are more in the same way of commentary. These books have all sorts of contemporary sources behind them, but are only written down at the time of or even after the exile. They're trying to explain why prophecy failed, why it seemed that the very promises of God had come to nothing. They're sometimes called the Deuteronomic history because they draw strongly on the teaching of Deuteronomy in their analysis, that there is a right way and there is a wrong way. The right way leads to life, the wrong way leads to death. The whole history of Israel since David has been a tendency to apostasy, to falling away, to choose death, not life. And so the purpose of the history books is to tell this story in detail. So that's the Torah, the law, and the prophets including the history books, and thirdly, the writings. This third part of the Hebrew Bible contains much more speculative material. It's poetry and philosophy, not much concerned with the great movements of history, but more with making sense of the law in daily life. So, for instance, the book of Job is an extended meditation on the classic theme of why does God let bad things happen to good people? And Psalm 119, over 176 verses, ponders on the nature of the law and how to live in righteousness, couched in deeply personal terms, and ending with the beautiful act of commitment, I have gone astray like a sheep that is lost. O seek your servant, for I do not forget your commandments. So my suggestion here is that the whole of the Hebrew Bible is about law. The first 5 books state the law in terms of instructions and in the context of the covenant of love between God and the people. The prophetic books then analyse the history of Israel in the context of the law to explain why the exile happened, and the writings seek to apply the law to daily life. And so, law, covenant, and the theological legacy of the exile. Law, covenant, and the theological legacy of the exile. So what happens to all this in the catastrophe of the exile, and what comes after? The exile, as I've suggested, is a political and national crisis, certainly the actual deportation of a people, and potentially the end of a whole culture. But, for remember that there is no such thing as politics without religion, or religion without politics in Old Testament perspective, for the Jewish people, the exile is fundamentally a theological and spiritual crisis concerning the relationship between God and between the people with God and his promises. The people have lost everything. They have lost the king, the anointed of God. They have lost the holy temple, the centre of life and faith. They have lost the land that God promised to give them to live in forever. And the promises of the law now seem empty, as God seems to have given up on his people. In the words of the modern poet Geoffrey Hill, suddenly God seems distant, difficult. In fact, it's clear that for some of the Jewish people, the exile did indeed signal the end of faith. If this is how God can behave, they reasoned, he certainly could not be a God worth believing in. This, of course, is very familiar territory for all people of faith, say in the context of the atrocities of 2 world wars. How can a good God allow such suffering? If he does, he cannot be a God worth believing in. That could be the subject of a whole other lecture series. I simply want to note here that these questions were live ones for Jews in the 5th century BC, and as already noted, gave rise to such extraordinary writings as the book of Job. Alongside this minority rejection of God in the face of the apparent failure of law and covenant, there are 3 other key theological responses provoked by the exile. First, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah describe the return of the exiles from Babylon to a shattered Jerusalem in the 6th century BC. But like the whole of the Old Testament narrative, it is no mere history lesson. It is drenched in a very particular theological understanding. At base, it says the exile happened because the Jews failed to keep the law, and that the only way forward is a renewal of the law in all its fullness and detail. Nehemiah particularly insists on Sabbath observance, tithing, and forcing Jewish men to separate from their foreign wives. Nehemiah rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem, and it is difficult not to see this as a metaphor for his whole project. If only we can build the walls high enough, then we can stay pure and keep the law. Secondly, Isaiah. Isaiah is a complete contrast. The second part of the book of the prophet Isaiah, from chapter 40 onwards, was written in the context of the exile and represents a very different theological response. He is seeking to answer the kind of question posed by that other prophet of the exile, Ezekiel. How can we go on living? That's Ezekiel 33:10. And the heartrending cry of Psalm 137, how can we sing the Lord's song in an alien land? The writer of Isaiah refuses to accept that the covenant has failed, that the law is finished, and that God has given up on his promises. But he also refuses to accept the solution provided by Ezra and Nehemiah. As Isaiah does encourage Jews once again to observe the Sabbath, but for him this is not about ritual obligation, but about the renewal of the covenant between God and his people. For Isaiah there is a recognition that the exile has been a catastrophe. But out of the ashes of this disaster is the invitation to renewal and the promise of a future. God, says the prophet, is still alive and active in history, and God will bring them home. And thirdly, Ezekiel. Ezekiel is certainly a minority voice in the Old Testament and was the last book to be included when the Jewish community was coming to a common mind about the contents of the Hebrew Bible. In many ways, a lot of Ezekiel's thinking drives a coach and horses through much of the Old Testament. And to this day, the first chapter of his book is regarded as too dangerous and misleading to be read aloud in the Jewish community. His theological analysis of the exile, of why the exile happened and what it means, is startling. He sides with neither Ezra, Nehemiah, nor Isaiah. In Ezekiel, God is absolutely clear that the people of Israel are useless. They always have been, and they always will be. But, he says, for the sake of my name, I will bring them back from exile. The people cannot earn God's forgiveness in any way, but his sovereignty is absolute. Many have seen in Ezekiel the roots of Paul's understanding of God, found particularly in Galatians and Romans. And so to come to a conclusion, I've sought here to demonstrate that law and covenant are the core themes running through the Old Testament narrative, and that the whole Hebrew Bible is an extended examination of the themes raised by God's promise and the people's failure. I've sought to show that Old Testament history is crucial to an understanding of law and covenant, precisely because it is written as a kind of divine history, in the conviction that through the unfolding of what is happening, the story of God's relationship with his people is being told. And I've sought to show that the catastrophe of the exile is the crucial lens through which the themes of law and covenant, and therefore the issues of God's love and human responsibility, are seen. In conclusion, I want to point to the splendidly subversive nature of the Old Testament narrative when it comes to law and covenant. We have seen above how Ezra and Nehemiah respond to the exile by seeking to make the Jewish nation pure once again. At the same time, someone unnamed produced one of the shortest books in the Bible, the book of Ruth. On the face of it, it's a very simple story about faithfulness and the promises of God. But the point of the book is in the last line. They named him, that's Ruth's son, Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. That's Ruth 4:17. And the point? Well, rather like the reference to Ruth at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, a very important point. If the people of Israel think that simply keeping the law and being pure will somehow restore the covenant love of God, then remember, David's granny wasn't Jewish, so neither is David, and the whole edifice comes tumbling down. And perhaps, if my friend Scott read the book of Ruth a little more, he would discover that whether he drove to synagogue, caught the bus, or bought a metro ticket, well, it would still be okay. Because, as one of the great poets of the exile says, The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. That's Lamentations chapter 3. Thank you for listening. That's been a podcast on law and covenant in Old Testament narrative. And I'm always eager to engage with people. So please, if you've got any questions, do let me know and I'll seek to answer them. You can find the text of this on the Cathedral website, and you can also find just a two-page version on the history of Israel, which I hope is helpful.